Welcome back to Analysis, where we're discussing the ongoing crisis in the Crimea following the Russian occupation of the region. Crimea is home to over 200,000 Crimean Tatars, a Turkic Muslim people who have lived in the region for centuries. The Tatars, once the majority in the whole Crimea 2 centuries ago, were deported by Stalin to Central Asia in 1944, with the population only allowed to return after 1989. Now, while only 13% of the population, the Crimean Tatars are said to be the most organized of the various Crimean minority groups. Under the government of deposed Viktor Yanukovych, they were said to have been squeezed out of public life in the Crimea. So do they now face even worse persecution? Remaining with me to discuss this in the studio are Bill Bowering, Professor of Law at Birkbeck College, University of London, Marat Sterin, Senior Lecturer in the Sociology of Religion at King's College, London. Well, Bill, let me come back to you again. I mean, how bad has the position of the Crimean Tatars been over the last 20 years? And do you think it's now suddenly going to get a lot worse because of this tension?
Well, I think one has to go back several centuries, of course, but 1944, they were sent to what is now Uzbekistan. Half of them died in the process. They were literally overnight loaded onto cattle trucks and taken to, so a massive, and this is what every Crimean Tatar has in the forefront of their mind. Half of them are still in Uzbekistan, and about half of them have managed to get back to Crimea. They've had massive problems, for example, getting Ukrainian citizenship over the years, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, they found they had Uzbek citizenship, which they didn't want, and they had to pay money, serious money, to get rid of, and Ukraine wouldn't take them until they got rid of it. By virtue of not being citizens, they were excluded from land privatization, which occurred after 1991. So they've really suffered great discrimination. However, on the other side, initially, in the 90s, they had a quota in the Crimean parliament. Then that was taken away from them. And actually, there's been a serious problem with relation to their language, to do with representation. However, as is being pointed out, they are very well organized, extremely well organized. And I would say that's a key factor in why Russia would not want to absorb Crimea, because they'd be taking on a big headache.
Well, let me just clarify. You're saying that under all governments of independent Ukraine, not just under Yanukovych, they suffered badly or they didn't get rights of land and so on. So Tymoshenko, Yushchenko, Kuchma were just as bad as Yanukovych on this point.
They've had a continuing problem. And I would say the person who was seen in the clip at the beginning, Refat Chubarov, actually had an alliance with the Ukrainian nationalists for quite a few years, is a member of the parliament in Kiev. And the Crimean Tatars have another representative in Kiev, Mustafa Dzhemilov, or Dzhemiloglu, who is the Nelson Mandela of the Crimean Tatars and was more than 12 times in prison in the Soviet period, held hunger strikes and demonstrations in Red Square when that was absolutely prohibited, and has been their leader ever since. So it's been a battle for them. But actually, they have made serious advances in terms of education, in terms of language. And the trouble they see with the present situation is that nobody is now interested in them, because it's seen as being a battle between Putin on the one side and Ukraine on the other.
Well, that's true, but on the other hand, the focus of the world media is on Crimea, and so we are sitting here, for example, now talking about the Tatars, which we were not doing 3 weeks ago. So they have got some publicity out of this.
In the
geopolitical. Well, do you think, Dr. Sterin, I think you've said somewhere that they're treated both better and worse than the other minority groups in the peninsula. I mean, can you just explain who the other minority groups are and why it's better or worse?
I think that it involves better and worse situation compared to other minorities.
Which are the other minorities, first of all?
Well, you know, the Ukrainians are a minority there, you know, and you know, some other minorities like, you know, enclaves of Jews and things like this, but it's mainly vis-a-vis minority. And in relation to Russians who are a minority, you know, in Ukraine. So what I actually meant, part of it has been said, that on the one hand they're much better organized, and it very much kind of, you know, comes from the history of deportation and, you know, coming back and having to establish themselves organized. They're very well organized. They've got quite good representations in, let's say, the organizations such as Mejlis, and Kurultai, and others. They're quite aspirational, quite entrepreneurial, and the one aspect of Crimea which shouldn't kind of go unnoticed, that Crimea in many ways is an absolutely fascinating place historically, geographically. It could be a thriving peninsula, in terms of developing tourism and things like this, and Tatars could contribute to it precisely because of their
What does the Mejlis,
entrepreneurial.
their parliament, actually do? What functions, what power does it have? Does it have any at all?
Well, it's a representational body. It kind of represents their interests, their aspiration and struggle for rights, and things like this. Probably you can tell.
But
more
it's not a
about.
legislature or anything.
No,
like
no, it's
that.
not legislature.
And
So it's kind of cultural organization, cultural political organization, part of civil society, I would say,
Right,
civil
okay.
society organization. In this sense, probably they're in a better position in terms of their potential and their organization. On the other hand, apart from what has been said in terms of their social deprivation, their being sort of put in enclaves, and given really the worst lands, in that paradise, if you like, as Crimea is, there is a lot of prejudice against them. And another thing, probably we should remember that Crimea has a very peculiar demographic makeup. A great proportion of Crimean population are former Russian, Ukrainian military, people with particular attitudes, particular, if you like, historical memory, nostalgia for the Soviet past, an attitude to ethnic minorities, such as, for them, they're traitors.
But Bill, are there some Tatars there in Crimea who actually support the Russian side, political side, in this particular argument?
A few. But can I just, a point not mentioned so far is that the Crimean Tatar language is very close to Turkish.
Right.
And Turkey is actually very close, just the other side of the Black Sea. And there's a diaspora of at least 2 million Crimean Tatars who identify as such in Turkey, quite a substantial number in Bulgaria, which has a large Turkish minority, a large proportion of whom are Crimean Tatars. So one has to bear in mind, many Crimean Tatars go to study in Turkey and then return to Crimea. So I think one has to bear in mind that this is not simply the peninsula, but it concerns actually the whole of the Black Sea, and Turkey has a very live interest.
And this is all since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In pre-1991, presumably the Crimean Tatars couldn't go and study in Turkey, or could they?
Well, so this is during the latter years of Perestroika, when of course, they were excluded from Crimea. They weren't even there. So only from the late 80s onwards did they start returning to Crimea. And of course, that's when the language began to revive. There began to be Crimean Tatar education, and people could begin to go to Turkey to study.
And what is the link with Tatarstan in Kazan and so on?
Well, they're of course all part of. Don't forget that Russia started in Kiev and Rus, which was then overwhelmed by Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde, who ruled the whole area for 300 years. And so there are Turkic peoples right the way across the region. And so the Kazan Tatars, of whom there are 5.5 million, by the way, it's the biggest minority in Russia. And Tatarstan is a very rich region and very powerful, almost completely autonomous within Russia. So that's an added complication, but it's not the only one. There are other Turkic republics within Russia. And then one has Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan.
But if you're a Crimean Tatar and you go to Kazan, to Tatarstan in Russia, in the Russian Federation, can you understand what people are saying?
No.
Completely different language.
Well, it's Turkic language, so there's something in common, but they're not mutually comprehensible.
Yeah, there have been some interesting developments, if I may add, which show the kind of significance, the Tatars have acquired in this kind of current situation. The current sort of government in Crimea offered them $21 or $22 million, for development. I don't know where they're going to get this money because, their financial situation is dire. But it shows that they need a kind of, to provide a soap to attract their vote to attract their support. On the other hand, Tatarstan, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, their prime minister also offered them support, probably, sort of trying to move their loyalty from Turkey to Tatarstan.
Now, in some of the northern Caucasus Muslim republics, there has been a rise of some kind of Islamic fundamentalism, and some terrorist incidents have taken place in Dagestan, obviously Chechnya, etc. Is there any hint of that developing or happening at all among the Crimean Tatars?
Well, obviously, when we talk about Islam in the northern Caucasus, we should also be very, very careful, because Islam is resurgent in many different forms. It's not only, militant fundamentalism or violent fundamentalism. As far as I know, we don't have any evidence of this kind of, developments in Crimea.
But could if they were to be taken into the Russian Federation, maybe it would then begin, would it? People would be resisted with force.
Well, it's a very sort of difficult thing to predict, but obviously, if they're taken into the Russian Federation against their will, you might create conditions for what we sometimes call radicalization. It's possible, but I wouldn't make any predictions on this.
But why was Crimea given this special status within Ukraine? Before this crisis started, it already had a prime minister, which of course no other district of Ukraine had. Why were they given special treatment?
This is because there was what we call an irredentist movement in the early years. Irredentists, in the sense, Russians wanting to rejoin Russia. And as we heard, Crimea was given to Ukraine by the Soviet Union, but it had been part of the Russian Federation up until 1954, given to Ukraine to commemorate the alleged treaty of unity between Russia and Ukraine 200 years previously. So that was the situation in which it was given. But as my colleague has pointed out, the Russian population in Crimea these days are mostly former servicemen and their families. So part of the complication is, initially there was an irredentist movement to rejoin Russia. The Autonomous Republic of Crimea was set up under the 1996 Constitution. It's an anomaly to have an autonomous republic within a unitary state, but that was to head off Russian sentiment, and it succeeded. Actually, there's been no serious irredentist movement since then.
So it wasn't created to set off Crimean Tatar nationalism?
No, nothing to do with the Tatars.
Nothing to do with the Tatars. And what was the attitude before this crisis began of the Tatar population towards Ukraine? I mean, in some of these demonstrations, people have been shouting Slava Ukraina,
exactly.
Glory to the
because
Ukraine.
The Majlis and Kurultai were always connected to the Rukh party,
right,
which was the main moderate Ukrainian nationalist party. The Rukh party unfortunately broke up, but both Chubarov and Dzhemiloglu got into the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, through the Rukh party, in fact. So they've always been connected with moderate Ukrainian nationalism, and that's where they see their interests lie.
And are there any Crimean, I mean, they are called Crimean Tatars, but are there any Tatars in eastern Ukraine outside the Crimea, or is it just, are they focused entirely on the Crimea?
Well, they're focused there. There are I think about sort of 95% of all Crimean Tatars live in Crimea. Yeah, there are some who live outside.
And the ones who you're saying in Uzbekistan, do they still there? Are some of them trying to drift back to Crimea?
They would like to.
What's the problem?
The fact is, I mean, as my colleague was saying, the land they have been given to live on in the steppe is awful. If you see the settlements where they live, and so many of the Crimean Tatars feel actually they live better they're living in the Fergana Valley, which is what is constantly being fought over, by the way. It's the nicest bit of Central Asia. That's where they live. And one interesting fact to me, in any case, is that when they came back to Crimea, they brought with them Uzbek food. So if you go to a Crimean Tatar restaurant in the Crimea or in Kiev, you'll be served plov, which is the national dish of Uzbekistan. So many of the Crimean Tatars, they're waiting to see if conditions improve in Crimea, and then they will return from Uzbekistan.
But they're not blocked by the Uzbek government from leaving if they want to?
I think the blockage comes more from the Ukrainian side.
not wanting to have any more of them.
No, because 14%. And apparently the proportion of Crimean Tatars in the schools is higher than the proportion in the population. So we will see a rapidly growing proportion of Crimean Tatars in the Crimean population.
And is the practice of Islam developing more now among these Crimean Tatars? Because under the Soviet Union, I mean, there was sort of massive secularization going on, wasn't there? Is Islam beginning to sort of re-emerge as a major issue?
Not an issue, but a kind of major cultural, if you like, reference mark of their identity. Yes, definitely. You know, there are organizations which offer, you know, courses on Islam and, you know, and studying Quran and building of mosques. It's all happening, definitely, and particularly in the younger generations. There are more and more sort of, you know, see themselves as Muslims, as opposed to just, you know, ethnic Tatars. It's happening, but it's quite a moderate development. It doesn't have any excesses, so we shouldn't assume that we're talking about Islamization or things like this. It's more kind of moderate cultural references and cultural practices.
And in the main cities in Crimea, Simferopol, for example, there's a high intermarriage rate between Russians and Crimean Tatars.
Exactly.
So at the ground level, they get on absolutely fine. And Rafat Chubarov told me that it was 30%, which is a high intermarriage rate, actually.
Well, which actually brings on to the point of the whole Russian religious identity and cultural identity. Is the Orthodox Church very sort of behind this move that's going on now to try to reintegrate with Russia?
I haven't seen it at all.
No sign of that.
And we should bear in mind that the Russian, the Orthodox Church in general, you know, in Ukraine is split. You know, there is the Moscow Patriarchate, which has kind of loyalty to Moscow, and there's Kievan Patriarchate, which is kind of national Ukrainian church, and even the Moscow Patriarchate is relatively loyal to the current, you know, authorities in Kiev. They didn't make any statement, you know, to the contrary. So I don't think that the church itself is a major factor, or churches, if you like, because there's, as I say, more than one church. Plus there are uniats, you know, it's a kind of, you know,
Catholics,
Christians who accept the authority of the Pope, but by right they're Orthodox Christians by their ritual and, you know, their kind of culture, they're Orthodox, but their jurisdiction is with the Vatican. So it's a very complex situation, and in a way, this complexity makes their competing claims sort of, you know, moderate.
Ukraine has conscription, doesn't it? But are Crimean Tatars exempt from being drafted into the Ukrainian armed forces?
I don't know.
You got me there.
I caught you there. So, I mean, I'm just wondering whether some of these clashes between Russian and Ukrainian forces in the standoffs, could there be Tatars among the Ukrainian forces?
I mean, to be frank, I don't think there's going to be an armed conflict because of the fact that the Russian armed forces, which are in pretty poor condition, but, you know, they are mobilizable, whereas I think it's highly unlikely that the Ukrainian army could be mobilized even if there was a desire so to do. Can I just say something about these soldiers, which I find quite bizarre, by the way. When I first saw them, they wear much better uniforms than the Russian army wear.
You mean these so-called local defense units?
They have brand new Kevlar uniforms, which I can tell you the Russian army soldiers do not have. The fact they had no insignia whatsoever. And of course, Putin, when he went on television in the press conference yesterday, was saying there are no Russian state forces in Crimea. And if there are people who appear to be soldiers, then they are actually just kind of local militias. Now, that is quite bizarre, is it not? So if these very up-to-date, clothed and armed soldiers who are seen kind of wandering around in a not very organised fashion, I have to say, if they're not Russian, then who on earth are they? And of course, one mustn't lose sight of the fact...
But where did they get the uniforms from if they're not the same as the Russian army uniforms?
Well, yes, this is the kind of question I ask myself. And why does Putin, in this press conference, contradict himself and also say things which appear to be contradicted by the facts? And I have to say that he did not look like a happy man during that press conference.
At what point did he contradict himself?
On contradicting himself on what is actually going on in relation to Crimea. And many people are saying, and I think I would agree with them, that not for the first time in his career, when faced with a crisis, Mr. Putin is paralyzed, actually, and he's basically indecisive. And the first time he was seen, several days of this crisis in Crimea was yesterday in the press conference. He was lying low up until then. And it looks very much as if events are being driven by people in the Russian armed forces and people in the Russian parliament. And I think it also should be noted that the most extreme right-wing politician in Russia, Mr. Zhirinovsky, was in Crimea at the precise moment when this situation blew up and when the first confrontation in Crimea was between the Crimean Tatars and Russian nationalists in Simferopol. So, and not forgetting, of course, that the Russians have the right until the year 2042 to be in the naval base of Sevastopol with a large body. I think they're entitled to 25,000 troops there.
But isn't it true that one of the first declarations of the Rada, the parliament, after Yanukovych fell, was to say we were going to terminate the agreement of the Black Sea Fleet? Wasn't that a bit of a provocation to say that?
Well, it's a kind of, there are so many provocations on both sides. Honestly, people saying really stupid things. And the fact is that the Russian Black Sea Fleet is there. Sevastopol is a completely Russian city with branches of the main Russian universities. I mean, it's a completely different world from anywhere else in Crimea. So I don't think that was seriously on the cards. And of course, the lease was already extended considerably.
By Yanukovych, yeah. Well, we're coming.
I know the kind of the move you're talking about in terms of Sevastopol was just a draft, and it's an important problem what we need to understand about the Ukrainian situation. But there is a problem of legitimacy because the current Ukrainian government doesn't reflect the kind of public opinion in Ukraine for obvious reasons. You know, we know how they came to power, but we have also to acknowledge that they are prepared to have proper elections and whatever. And that's the only way out of this situation.
We're coming rather to the end of the programme. We've got about a minute left. Just very briefly, do you think now the worst of this crisis is behind us, that it's not going to terminate in a war?
Well, somebody might shoot somebody else tomorrow.
Yeah.
Or today.
Well, I hope so, but you never know because the situation is very tense. There are certain, points where a conflict might be inflamed. I hope it won't happen. It looks that the Russians don't want it really,
But do you think that, I mean, obviously there could be an accident, but that doesn't have to lead to a war, even if there is one?
So I thought it was extremely significant that yesterday Putin was saying we haven't got any soldiers there and we don't want to incorporate it into Russia, and he couldn't have been clearer.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you. We've now come to the end of this episode of Analysis, and I'd like to thank my guests and, of course, you at home for watching. Please tune in again for future discussions, and don't forget that you can keep up with the discussion by following us on Twitter at the address below on the screen, or by following Islam Channel Current Affairs on Facebook. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.